Good morning. I, I wanted to provide some context this morning for what I wish to discuss on the topic of touch. In June of 2020, I listened to many things, as I think many people did, or at least people around me did, on different matters that related to the senses. Touch being one that was distant from us, maybe one that we were being deprived of at the time. I stumbled upon a lecture titled "To the Bone: Speculations on Touch" by Dr. Hortense Spillers. And so I wanted to start by sharing some of those words. It's a text that foregrounded and provided context for many formative experiences for me over the last few years. The question of touch, to be at hand without mediation or interference, might be considered the gateway to the most intimate experience and exchange of mutuality between subjects, or taken as the fundamental element of the absence of self-ownership. For example, it defines at once, in the latter instance, the most terrifying ontological and personal future of slavery's regimes across the long ages. When in an earlier piece of writing, I pursued the distinction between body and flesh, I was attempting to isolate futures of citizen belonging from alien bodies and entities. I'd associate bodiedness with juridical personality or historical actors who have access to what constitutional law calls due process. Under the impressive constitutional law or due process, other rights bearing follows in its wake. Flesh describes an alien entity, a more or less expendable figure. And this is an alien by all the ways that people can be alien: by race, by language, or culture and custom, and is, in any ways, not having access to the protocols of due process. But perhaps its most poignant determination is the extent to which such a body cannot prevent or ward off another's touch. For me, the single most powerful evidence of the loss of freedom is the fact that bodies lose their integrity and may become entered or invaded or penetrated, so to speak, by coercive power. This touch that we associate with intimacy can, under the right conditions, engender invasion and violence, and in its immediacy in relationship to the enslaved, robs the haptic of its power to heal, to bind, to cure, and instead becomes the power to wound and violate. So the captive body's susceptibility to being touched is this body on the side of flesh. So that touching here is not a token of social cohesion or brotherhood or fellowship or fellow feeling, but rather the very breadth and depth of alienation, among other things. Alienation from the laws, and perhaps even ways of distinguishing human life from bare life. Spiller's writing reminded me a great deal of the ending of chapter 1 of Frederick Douglass's narrative. And in this chapter, he creates a detailed account of his first introduction to what would become slavery. In speaking about the beating of his Aunt Hester by their master, Douglass states, "I wish I could commit to paper the feelings with which I beheld it. It seems to me that this is an experience held by Black subjects across time, a desire or a wish to be able to describe an indescribable experience. The desire to be able to describe experiences that only happen to flesh, experiences that shouldn't happen to anybody." In rereading the end of the chapter, I was reminded of why Spiller's text struck a chord with me, why it resonated so deeply, and why I've been listening to it nearly every day for over a year. This feeling of not being able to commit to paper an experience that one had felt, one that sits on the body forever, is something that I felt quite recently. In attempting to write about two experiences that I had once moving to the southern region of the United States, specifically New Orleans, Louisiana, I was struck by an encounter with a man who I formerly worked with in a restaurant in the central business district of the city. He cooked proteins at the restaurant and worked the middle of the line with two other cooks. We had not seen each other in 2 years. But in this encounter, as we held hands, not shook hands, but truly held hands, I wondered, had he ever known that I had been touched? How do you touch someone else's child? How do you touch someone else's child? with no remorse. How do you take someone else's body? How do you wish to possess somebody else's body? The line from Douglas brought me to another memory. One not of sexual nature this time. One not of molestation, but one of great physical danger. In the neighborhood known as Mid-City in New Orleans, a taller, somewhere roughly between 5'11" and 6 feet, a white woman had my hand stuck inside of a folding table. And as my hand sat in a folding table, attempting to close the table due to anger and frustration, her leg accidentally began to kick the table. My hand caught inside of the table. My right hand, my drawing hand, my writing hand, my hand. In the ricochet that occurred, I spent the next 30 minutes looking at my hand, the red marks that had been made without any blood drawn. It's an experience that I have often now when I'm biking, when I'm running, when I'm writing, when I'm sleeping. I find myself looking at my hand, wondering what it would have been like had my hand ended up being further manhandled, had my hand ended up having the same legacy as the backside of Aunt Hester. These experiences with flesh they've pushed me to ask a specific question. What is the meaning of feeling for those that are descendants of individuals who had to go look for their bodies? Perhaps, what is the meaning of feeling for those of us that continuously have to go looking for our bodies? And thinking about that hand, this hand that I am with every day, I'm reminded of a memory that comes from a dream. When Philando was killed, I dreamt of an officer murdering my sister. Perhaps not murder. He pushed her off of a bridge into an open body of water by throwing her out of her car. she was a new driver. In the dream, a reoccurring dream, I look over the top of that bridge. Blood engulfs those blue waters. So what do we make of feeling? What do we make of the extent to feel? For those of us that feel differently every time we hear one of these names, because no one is watching the footage, none of us at least. But just the name, enough to shatter me. In these last years, of being here in this part of the country, witnessing the normalcy of abuse, it has affirmed to me one thing. It is unlikely or impossible that there will ever be enough consensus across class lines to save this ship. How many pounds of flesh will it take to sink this ship? Because the skinning, the usage of skin as flag, that is not going to end. So instead we have these other more emotional coping responses. We don't have a blueprint for a counter to violence. Those disappeared, or were erased rather, as the Revolutionary Era ended. With those blueprints gone, and the ship sinking, but somehow still quite afloat, and my body and my family's bodies still being skinned for flags. In the wake of that, I want to propose another alternative, another form of communal gathering. There's no rescue team coming for the ship. So perhaps we continue to do this and get up and leave the house late or early in the dark to be together, to practice breathing, a type of breathing that is a testament to will, a type of breathing that honors those who had no access to mobility, who didn't have any sense of access to moving around in this capacity. Perhaps we get up, shoulder to shoulder, breath to breath, bone to bone, flesh to flesh, and see what comes of it. See what comes of all of us breathing together. An experience I've never had. One that I would believe culturally could change us. Help us add a layer of understanding for one another. One that could continue to shape and reform and reshape the terrain of contact, the terrain of touch. What parts of ourselves can we give to each other? Hartman asked in her writing last year, how is love possible for those dispossessed of the future? And is love a synonym for abolition? This morning, I'm asking, what is at stake in choosing to breathe? Let us remain here for this moment. Let us remain untouched. Right. Turn right then left. Right then left.